Hi, and welcome back to Five Big Things for the Future of ESG. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this series builds off of the Pocket Guide to Combat ESG Skeptics, a resource that we launched to help investors and practitioners cut through the ideological noise and apply ESG with more rigor, evidence, and clarity. As those of you who are joining us again know, each episode tackles one big shift that we believe will make ESG stronger and more durable in today's economy. Our first episode discussed the importance of putting workers at the center of the conversation. Episode 2 focused on reframing climate risk as business risk. And today, we are focusing on something incredibly foundational, getting your risk framework in order. In the Pocket Guide, we address one of the more common criticisms of ESG, that there's no single universal definition. Critics often argue that this makes ESG meaningless, but that critique misunderstands how risk management actually works. And we have seen in real time how that misunderstanding has translated into political and legal action meant to punish organizations that are trying to design companies for a 21st century world. Which brings me to today's guest, one of several leaders trying to combat this moment by equipping organizations with both the resources and the training to deploy and defend ESG with rigor. Erika Seth Davies is the CEO of ReVentures, working at the intersection of racial equity, women's health, and capital to drive systems change and financial returns. She is also the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab and a founding member of Freedom Economy. Erika, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on a topic that I really care a lot about.
I want to start at the beginning because the work that you're doing with Freedom Economy is actually very indicative of the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think a lot of folks are probably experiencing some of the challenge that you all are seeking to address, but just don't really know how to put language around it. So can you share a little bit about what you're building and why?
Sure. I will begin at the beginning because I think origin stories matter. And the purpose and point of Freedom Economy actually started back in 2023. So when we saw the lawsuit against the Fearless Fund, and when I say we, there was a group of investors and other field builders in impact investing, and it happened to be a small group of Black women actually saw what was happening with the Fearless Fund and started to mobilize because we knew what the intention of that lawsuit was. It was to have a chilling effect, and that was the case. And so seeing that start to move forward, we were mobilizing to get ahead of what would come next. And what would come next is the next wave of attacks on the work that we all cared about, which was more focused for us. Some of it was climate, some of it was health, some of it was economic mobility, but the theme through all of it was a lens of equity. All of it was how do we close gaps, whether it's in health disparities, economic opportunity, effects of climate change, or participation in sort of the movement around climate. So no matter what the theme was, we were all committed to and very clear about the equity lens on all of that and how that was what was really being endangered. And so the purpose of Freedom Economy, as we started to organize it, was to bring folks together so that there was collective voice, that there was shared messaging. There was opportunity to access resources, legal resources, and that there was community for the sake of community in the moment, because that's so crucial, right? Like part of the effort when retrenchment is happening, and that's what we were basically watching start to roll in real time, is to isolate and start picking people off. So if you can have people believe that it's just them, or nobody else really cares about this, or if we come after you, then we'll chill it for everybody else. Like that's what we were trying to get ahead of as well. And so looking at the ways in which ESG and DEI had sort of been separate, but we're both under attack. In starting to frame Freedom Economy, we brought those things together as well, which usually do not play in the same sandbox, right? So maybe a little parallel play, but we're not playing together in the same sandbox. And so that was yet another opportunity to do more of that as well, because again, everything was under attack. So that was what the origin of Freedom Economy was, and it started with the conversation back in 2023.
What I love about what you just said about a parallel but coming together, one of the things that we really try and focus on in the Pocket Guide is for folks that are overwhelmed, let's say, with the moral argument, which I think we can both have personal perspectives on whether we live in a time where you can afford to be overwhelmed by the moral argument. But let's just say for a moment that that exhausts you. I think my biggest frustration in doing this work is that the idea around risk has disappeared in this conversation. And it is true that if you are not thinking about your people and all of their richness and availability, you're not thinking about the business. I think that that's more true actually today than it ever was before. So if they don't have voice or agency or means or energy, I mean, these are business imperative considerations. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether this idea of thinking about people in all of their identity is just part of thinking about holistic 21st century risk. Does that show up in the way that you talk about it? Is question number one. And then maybe related, I'd love to hear how investors and partners react to that.
So it's always been how
Yeah, exactly.
I've shown up. It's what you can't help it, quite frankly. So
That's right.
what I think is incredibly interesting, and certainly from the with my RIA hat on, is the way that we've developed our strategy.
Yeah.
And think about this work certainly in women's health, is like that's where you see around corners. That's where you find the innovation. That's where really the leverage starts to come into play. And
Yeah.
it's not to throw everything else overboard because we're going to focus on a different community. It's
Right.
how do you broaden the aperture so that you see the opportunity that has been invisible, right? It's just been made invisible,
Yeah.
invisibilized, because if you don't ask the questions and there's no answer, but start asking the questions, that's
Right.
signaling, and then you start to get a different set of responses. And so when you bring that into play, you actually see more, right? So
Yeah.
whether I'll take the investor perspective in a diligence process or sourcing or whatever the case may be, when you think beyond the average or the typical, which usually defaults to, in the case of sort of women's health investing, that's going to default to those with private insurance,
Yep.
right? Um,
Right.
and it's usually going to be white women
Yeah.
who are middle class or wealthy, that are going to drive the conversation around
Yep.
priorities, where funding goes, et cetera. But if we bring an equity lens, we see a broader marketplace. We see problem solving a lot differently. If we're not thinking about treatment through that lens, right, like then we're cutting off some of our opportunity. If we're thinking about, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and we're not looking at the ways in which weathering, right, which has been documented to happen
Yeah.
for Black women, for example, or
Yeah.
other marginalized groups, the
Yeah.
weathering and how that
Yeah.
affects cardiovascular health, you're actually only seeing part of the solution as well. So
Yeah.
all these things that we can be looking at through this lens gives us more information. It's more data. It's right, like it's a more access to
Yeah.
the marketplace as well. So to me, it's just it's a more comprehensive view. You can mitigate risk, but you can
Right.
also find more opportunity when you're asking the right set of questions. And so I think
Right.
that's part of it as well. So at RIA Ventures, to be able to hold our mission for operating at the intersections of racial equity, women's health, and capital to drive systems change, innovation, and social and financial return in
Mm-hmm.
an environment that is trying to outlaw the words diversity,
Right.
equity, and inclusion, or the concept of advancing this type of work. You can't use the word woman, et cetera, et cetera. We
Right.
knew that we were going to be in the crosshairs potentially, given what we do. So wanted to be able to take a serious look at what risk is for us, and then organize our work, so we understood where those potential targets could come from, or where that
Mm-hmm.
targeting could happen. And so we were asking the questions, what are the most critical risks or threats to our mission, and or those organizations that we're supporting?
Yeah.
How severe would be the impact of those risks? How
Yeah.
likely are those risks to occur?
Yeah.
Then what demands the most urgent decisions or actions? And then how do we understand our appetite for that risk by going through those questions, really, and trying to get to a place of, okay, well, we know this could happen. We've discussed it. This is how we would address it. Are we mitigating it? Is it something that we can transfer the risk to, insurance, right?
Yeah.
Or making sure that we've got, a strong legal partner. How do we manage each of these things?
Yeah.
And what I will say is it brought the temperature down for the team,
Yeah.
where all of a sudden there was specificity There was clarity, and there
Yeah.
was a sense of next step. There was action that we could take. And so when
Yes.
you start to figure out, we will control what we can control, and we will
Yeah.
come into agreement on where people feel like, okay, personally, I can't take that risk. We
Yeah.
understood in the context of the work, the organization, and what would potentially even drive the organization out of business, or that might be inconvenient, but we can navigate that.
Yeah.
Or okay, we understand how this particular team, because of their public statements and where they operate, this one may need to be handled a little bit differently. And so all of a
Yeah.
sudden we had the information, we had the way to make sure that collectively we were understanding how to protect the organization and the people within it. So
Yeah.
that has been incredibly helpful, something that we started with the work that was coming out of Freedom Economy, right? Like sort
Right.
of the best practice document. That was a starting point for us, just reviewing documents, our policies, reviewing or getting ready for, if there's potential legal action, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that Freedom Economy checklist was incredibly helpful as the starting point for us, and then we took that a step further and really dug into what are we talking about,
Right.
right? Like,
Right.
so
I think when you talk about opportunity, because it is true that I think approaching it from a risk lens is one piece of it. There is a piece in here about missing opportunity. One of my favorites is the example of All Life in South Africa. I'm sure it's familiar to you, but for those that it's not familiar this is basically an insurance company that specifically focuses on South Africans that are dealing with HIV/AIDS and the way they've been chronically ignored by the life insurance, health insurance markets. And
mhm.
what's interesting about that particular disease is we have come so far from the 80s and 90s, but the way that we think about that disease is so rooted in misperception around what that disease is like. It is nowadays very manageable if you stay on top of your medication and lifestyle interventions. Life expectancy is comparable to people who die of other more natural diseases. I'm thinking about heart disease and heart failure. And if you can provide financial incentives or payment plans, those patients are actually incredibly on top of those things because they have to be on top of their medication. And so All Life came to the market and said, this is silly. We have not updated our perception of risk. We are relying on a misperception of risk. And so there is opportunity, financial opportunity out there that others are missing because of sort of this really old way of thinking. I think about that when I think
Mhm.
about elements like race, gender, and even socioeconomic sort of
Oh,
segregation in a different way. It's a missed opportunity, and I wonder if you could opine a little bit, whether it's through freedom or but I know we could talk about this all day, but I think it's important that someone like you, who has actually looked at an investment play in these spaces,
mhm.
has an opportunity to speak to that because it really is as much about opportunity too.
Sure. So if you zoom all the way out, just women's health as an investment opportunity is actually a good example.
Yeah.
So been around. We've been here. So it's not like a hidden marketplace,
That's
right?
right.
But it's
That's
been a
right.
ghost market, right?
Yeah.
So it's hanging out here in the shadows
Yeah.
because no one will move capital into this space.
Yeah.
And tying it back to even the work of freedom economy. So when you
Yeah.
eliminate DEI, when you were just like, we don't want to talk about it, it's not valuable, it's risky, all these other kinds of things. If that were the case, if you didn't need to have a diversity of voices and perspectives at the table, how'd you miss
Yeah.
the women's market? How did how
Yeah.
did, how did men as investors
Yeah.
miss a I mean a massive market? Like just
Yeah.
menopause treatment alone,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
massive, right? So you
Right.
live long enough, we all go through it.
Yeah.
So
Right.
that's a huge market.
Yeah.
How do you miss those things? Because you don't have the lived experience. You don't care in the same way that people who wake up in the middle of the night drowned in their own sweat
That's right.
want a treatment. They want a solution, right? And
That's right.
so the solutions started to be developed. And when the funding was coming online, it was coming from women who were creating the fund vehicles
That's right.
to to drive money to the innovations that were going to save our own lives, right? And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
can even speak to my experience. Like I have used the portfolio companies in our portfolio for
Mm.
my own or my family's treatment, right? Like so
Yeah.
we're interacting with these things and interacting with companies that didn't exist 10 years ago or 5 years ago as a result of this increased funding that is now happening in the women's health innovation and investment ecosystem. So
Yeah.
I'll go back to the idea of DEI. If you
Yeah.
don't need a diversity of perspectives at the table,
Yeah.
how did you miss this
Yeah.
massive market, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then now that it actually exists, and these opportunities, whether it's fund vehicles, fund investment, or direct investment, to still hear things like, isn't this a bit of a niche market from investors? And we still hear things like that.
Yeah.
Well, there are no exits. So first of all, AOA recently published a report about exits
Yeah.
around women's health, and there are more than people realize.
Yeah.
They've simply not been counted that way. But then the other is you haven't been investing in this market. Why would you expect to see exits in the same
Correct.
way that you would see them in other categories? And to be clear, it doesn't operate like other categories. And
That's right.
so, um, but you'll find that out and you'll find out the
Yeah.
demand and you'll understand the opportunities when you have women sitting at the table who are evaluating and understanding and growing that
Yeah.
marketplace and understanding of what's going on in that market as well. And so to me, that's the biggest like flaming in neon lights. How did
Totally.
you miss them? And
Yeah.
so when the attack comes on DEI and ESG and the overlap even of those things, you're kind of starting to cut off your opportunity for growth. And I thought that was the whole purpose, right? Like to
Yep.
discover new markets and to preserve and grow capital. And
Yeah.
that's just so answer riddle me this
Yeah.
kind of moment
Yeah.
because it's pretty obvious to me that you didn't get it. You didn't get it right.
Yeah.
And so if we apply that to other ways in which identity can show up, so whether it is around race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geography, right? Like if we don't take those things much more seriously and integrate an understanding, a better understanding of those ideas
Yeah.
as a lens, not merely a pillar, then we continue to miss where the real growth opportunities could be existing.
It struck for me, I think, another part of the ESG conversation that we often skip over. And I wonder if we skip over it because it's both complicated and a little boring. So bear with me because I'm going to ask you some questions about it in case anyone who's
Here
watching
for it.
this is not turned off by it at all. But I think one of the things that gets glossed over when we talk about this work, I'm going to talk specifically about ESG, but I think it's applicable in all the domains we're talking about, is this idea of materiality. So for folks that this term is new to, the idea here is that there are non-financial factors that have financial consequences on your business, your investment, your choices. It could be personal, it could be internal, it could be extrinsic, right? And I think what is so interesting is that in an attempt to be as simple as possible, which is human nature, we don't have much room or patience for the nuance that I think is required to really think about these risks. So my favorite example that we give to our clients all the time is that, if you're a juice or soda provider and you use water to literally create the products that you sell, global water scarcity should be a deeply important thing for you. It should show up on the balance sheet. It should show up in the way that you think about risk. It should show in the our operational protocols. It even shows up in hiring, right? How do we make sure we continue to have this input so we can design the thing that we do and then sell it? If you're an investment bank in New York City, water is important to you, but may not be the most important thing you're thinking about. You might be thinking about your people and electricity costs. And so I would argue that water preservation, the scarcity of water for the beverage company should be something that every member of the C-suite is thinking about on a weekly basis. And that to me is values agnostic. That to me is just running a really good firm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how materiality is showing up when you're working with not just members of Freedom Economy, but just broadly across your investor base. Like, how is it showing up? How is that conversation evolving?
Quite centrally, actually. So
Yeah.
we have a corporate engagement shareholder advocacy program, corporate
Yeah.
engagement, really, and have to think about materiality all the time
Mm-hmm.
when contemplating shareholder proposals. What makes sense, the degree to
Mm-hmm.
which something that may be put in front of a company actually has an impact on the bottom line, right? So
Yeah.
recognizing the role that shareholders play as stakeholders in that process. So we look at it through the lens of the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Right.
if you need a healthy workforce, and we know that close to half the workforce, especially in places like Walmart or some of these other really large publicly traded companies that also have a lot of low-wage workers
Yeah.
in the workforce, that their ability to provide comprehensive health care, that their ability to have HR policies that account for reproductive and maternal health care needs
Yes.
actually extends the ability of women and birthing people to be in and stay in the workforce, right?
Right.
So attrition is expensive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and or, sick days become expensive. People like, so how do we think about even how we define sick days? But anyway, how think about all of these things a little bit more comprehensively, and what are the things that could and should be in place to extend one's ability to even remain in the workforce around these life issues and concerns, right? So how do you
Yep.
target the resources? How do you target those policies so that they are getting to that nuance and getting to the differentiation that needs to exist within the workforce? And
Yeah.
that's to us how we think about that. And so working with investors to provide some of the support on submitting those shareholder proposals. We know that that's all strained right now
Yeah.
because of some of the current decisions of the SEC, but
Yeah.
that's long been a way for investors to um, express their values,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And to bring those ideas to companies in a very legitimate process for
Yeah.
reflection and understanding.
I think what I have learned recently is that without materiality, ESG can drift into one of two traps. Trap number one is this moral argument, which is so easy to politicize. And I think we've seen that happen in real
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
Trap number two is that it becomes a scoring exercise, which is so easy to dismiss because that one score couldn't possibly capture the entire just sort of diversity of complexity that we're actually dealing with.
Yeah.
I'm sure that that in and of itself is too simple, but I was deeply interested in your take on where you think we've gone wrong, if we've gone wrong at all, in
Hmm.
how we communicate that this work is about risk management or materiality or business as usual. And maybe related to that, if you have an opinion on maybe why we find ourselves in this moment as it relates to ESG. I'm sure that in and of itself is a whole hour-long conversation, but I
That's a
would just,
totally different
yeah, yep. How much time we got?
podcast.
But I would just be curious, what you're seeing, particularly on the risk management, risk mitigation side, that you think maybe as an industry we have made a misstep, and this might actually be an opportunity to get even crisper in our language.
That's a good question. I can't tell what the misstep was
Yeah.
or if it's just the resistance to change. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like if it's
Mm-hmm.
or lack of incentives, right? So
Yeah.
you had Lilo and
Yeah.
talking about, and I know that's kind of a core to her work is
Yeah.
the incentives around some of this
Right.
these decisions that are made. So I think maybe we hadn't, if there was a misstep, it might be that there wasn't enough of an understanding of like the system and its levers that we should have been
Yes.
looking from the beginning
Yes.
to actually either make sure the pressure is growing from within, that it was so great that it had to be
Yeah.
addressed,
Yeah.
or that those leverage points were just so clear,
Yeah.
so understood that those are the things that we sort of focused on first. And so I think not maybe in the field,
Yeah.
I don't know that people had the muscle to know what to do in this moment.
Yeah.
Because we've just been kind of going along in our little silo, if you want to call it that. And it's
Right.
been very exciting to see the
Yeah.
emergence of impact investing or
Yeah.
values aligned investing or however we
Yeah.
want to frame it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then to see this wall, like I think everybody was shocked, like, wait a minute, where did this come from? But if you've been doing
Right.
the work, it wasn't very shocking.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
so maybe
Yeah.
the misstep was we didn't build the coalition soon enough, right?
Yeah.
Like that we didn't
Yeah.
have a broad enough understanding of what are we really asking for of
Right.
capital and capital markets.
Right.
Um, Somewhat asking it to solve problems that it caused, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's that. Maybe not being clear enough that this is a big systemic shift that we're
Yeah.
actually asking for. Because when you think about the way that the money moves to the chain,
Yeah.
people, investors, sort of the asset owners and investors, like they're outsourcing the risk all the time. They're
That's right.
outsourcing the cost all the time. It's not that it goes away.
Right.
They're just not having to deal with it. And
Right.
so it's going to someone else. Someone else is paying for it, right? Like, and we're paying
Yeah.
for it in the form of inequality. We're paying for it in the, form of low wages. We're paying for it
Right.
in the, because people are demanding their risk adjusted returns, right?
That's right.
So you get there to the market rate when the
Yeah.
market like ignores or pushes these other ideas out. So
That's
it's a
right.
pretty big shift to expect.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know how realistic we've collectively been about
Yeah.
really what we're asking of this system, and
Yeah.
the players in it, and how entrenched the mindset is.
Well, and I just think about, as you threaded that needle, and that really resonated with me. I don't know if I had thought about it from that entire systems point of view, but we do find ourselves in a moment where I think individuals are grappling with power across every single system. I think a little bit about how the employee ownership movement has
Mhm.
actually almost quietly gained bipartisan support, like
Yep.
tons of capital. The idea that employees could be owners is somehow not being met with resistance. And
Mhm.
yet most of the companies that are thinking about converting to these employee ownership trusts or the employee or ESOPs themselves have a huge amount of workers that are people of color. Like, that's actually, the Venn diagrams there are actually really, really tight. And we're not having an existential crisis on should workers be owners. In fact, but politicians from both sides of the aisle are co-signing bills together. And so it's interesting to me when you sort of talk about our naivete. There's a moment here where I think maybe there is sort of a societal reckoning with power,
Mhm.
and all of these different moments are sort of competing and clashing together instead of actually being organized together. And if at the end of the day, if you really look at it, they're all sort of advocating or agitating for the same change, which is that power is a little bit more diffuse than it has been in the
Mhm.
past. Which then just makes me even angrier that this particular segment of our work is being attacked so unilaterally. But again, it's probably a conversation for another day
But
that
that
we
was
could
why,
have.
why we thought about
Yeah,
freedom economy the way that we
yeah,
did, right? Like,
yeah,
so it was for the DEI and sustainability investors. So
yeah.
that's the first step in that coalition building,
Right.
right? And understanding solidarity. And it's so interesting because effectively we're having to use the tools of movement building and organizing, right?
Yes.
And campaigns that have
Yeah.
sort of sustained social movements over time. It's
Yeah.
happening in an audience and in a community that has never had to.
Right.
So we've never had to defend or have
Right.
never had to organize and
Right.
work collaboratively around keeping ground, right? Like just holding ground. Because as an investor, people just let you invest.
Correct. Yes.
You got a good idea. You got this, good
Here you go.
investment. Hey, here you go,
Yeah.
go do.
Yeah.
And kind of send the returns. And so now all of a sudden, we're having to pull out some of the tools, use some of the tools that may be unfamiliar to
Yeah.
folks to be able to have their work survive. Like
Yeah.
you now have to be part of a field, and right? And I can think about it that way.
Totally.
You now have to contemplate. Okay, you know what? If we all are going to move forward, then I've got to spend my time, right, like in these spaces, doing this work, building these relationships. So, to me, solidarity and coalition building are really important in this
Yes.
moment. And understanding that also through that lens of power, right? So
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you all do what I say. It means
That's
like
right.
I have to understand your issue, and it doesn't have to be mine. It doesn't have to be one that I champion explicitly, but I
Right.
do need to stand on business in certain ways
Yes.
beside you, right? So that's the part of the exercise I think that people are unfamiliar with, and now having to again develop the muscle to
Yeah.
be able to, so we can all continue to do the work that we had started.
That's
Um,
right. Yeah, that really resonates. You've just touched on this, but I want to make sure as we close out that we have a proper moment for it, because I think it's actually, of all the conversations we had, this one, I think, just the outcome of this touches so many of us so directly. I'm talking specifically just about the impact investing community who's out here trying to do this work. I think all of this is so deeply interconnected. And well, you're welcome to answer with the 101 hats that you wear. Any of the hats are welcome to answer, but because I know there's a lot of hats. We only talked about 3 of the hats, but I know there's a lot of hats. What does success look like to you? If this goes the way that it's supposed to go, what are you seeing in the market, in the conversation, that's giving you the sense that, okay, we're actually, even if we haven't won outright, we're
mhm.
headed in the right direction?
Good question. Um, there are little signals that I'm seeing,
Yeah.
and it just may be in the space in which we operate, but
Hmm.
probably particular investor types as well. So the family offices, high net worth individuals,
Yeah.
foundations, folks who, or the type of investors that either have mission or have values that are front and
Yeah.
center that they really do wrestle with,
Yeah.
or that have the flexibility to try it, to try
Yeah.
something new,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so in that way, like that's where some of this is going to, I think, make the difference in
Hmm.
what comes next. So
Yeah.
to be clear, when we look at the current system, it's not working, right? Like the
Right.
ways in which money has been moving, who had access, the way it's accumulating
Yes.
to drive this unbelievable inequality in our society, that is
Yes.
a destabilizing issue and concern that we really do
Yes.
need to tackle.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I don't want to gloss over it. I don't want to
Yeah.
oversimplify it,
Yeah.
but it's happening as a result of the way that our economy, and the way it's regulated or minimally
Yes.
regulated in some places.
Yes.
All of this, are like our tax code, like
Yeah.
all of that is it's why we are where we are now. So there are people and there are institutions that are like, this can't continue. We got to figure
Right.
something else out.
Right.
Um, but there seems to me to be a block on the scale of one's ability to just like, all right, you know what, we got to make big bets here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're still seeing a trickle, right? Like it's
Yeah.
still, to me, it's still kind of crumbs. And so
Yeah.
until we kind of push through and start to see really big bets on some of the impact strategies, then that'll be the thing that, okay, now everybody is doing more work. I am encouraged that there are folks that are starting to lean in that direction.
Yeah. I what I love about that vision is that I think it's very easy sometimes to think about reforming the system by burning it down. And I maybe my personal frustration is that I genuinely believe that we can actually reform the system through the system. It requires first and foremost though a recognition that it's broken. And I loved what you said about it not working because I interestingly enough, I think if you picked 100 people from all different corners, pockets, gulfs and troughs of this country, you would get a resounding agreement that
Mhm.
it isn't working. And so there is, I think, a way um, there is a way to work through this with the tools that we've built, but you have to start by saying my hammer is broken. Otherwise, it's just, you're just continuing to knock at something and really not getting anywhere. Erika, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure having you here. This conversation
Thank
has been a
you.
breath of fresh air. And again, like I said, I know that you wear 101 hats. So thank you for adding one more hat and
It's been
joining
a
us.
pleasure.